Good morning. Welcome to our third presentation in the 10 Years Hence lecture series. Our speaker this morning is Otto Berkes. As Chief Technology Officer of CA Technologies, Otto was responsible for technical leadership and innovation, further developing the company's technical community, and aligning its software strategy, architecture, and partner relationships to deliver customer value. Otto joined CA on June 15, 2015. As a 25-year industry veteran, he has a passion for innovation and development. He has extensive experience leading the development of cutting-edge products and technologies. An early champion of mobile computing, he led the development of touch-based technologies, user interfaces, hardware architectures, and physical designs that were the forerunners to today's tablets. Before joining CA, Otto served as the Chief Technology Officer at HBO, where he directed efforts that created and delivered innovative digital technologies and products such as HBO Go. During his tenure, HBO Go became one of the most popular streaming services in the US. Previously, Otto spent 18 years at Microsoft and was one of the 4 original founders of Xbox. An advocate of diversity, he is a member of the University of Vermont STEM Leadership Council, where he is focused on addressing gender, racial, and economic gaps across all of the STEM disciplines. Otto earned a bachelor's degree in physics from Middlebury College in Vermont and a master's degree in computer science and electrical engineering from the University of Vermont. He is co-inventor on and holds multiple patents spanning design, mobile device interaction, and core computing technologies. Please join me in welcoming Otto Berkes.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and it's absolutely great to be here today. So what I want to talk about is technological change and the forces that drive it, and predictions, and how challenging predictions can actually be in the context of technological change. I'm going to use the genesis story of Xbox to frame some of the points that I'm going to be making. So the fact is that computers have, at this point, been around for a long time. We're at the 70-year point from when modern digital computers entered the scene, and our perceptions around computers have changed during that time. This is a photo from 1952. There was a UNIVAC computer that was used to try to predict the results of the Stevenson-Eisenhower election. And the computer actually predicted that Eisenhower would win. But the programmers and the staff, working the computer, actually held back that result because they felt that it was absolutely wrong. Human beings, the experts, pollsters, et cetera, political experts had predicted the exact opposite of outcome. So the thinking was that something must have gone terribly wrong with the programming and that the computer couldn't possibly be right. Today, we've really flipped to the other extreme end of the spectrum, and we think the computer can't possibly be wrong. I mean, after all, it's beating Go masters, it's beating chess masters, it's winning, on Jeopardy. So our perception of computers and how they fit into the fabric of our lives has changed dramatically over the course of decades. One of the challenges that we have predicting the future and the impact of technology on our lives and society is, to some extent, based in our own kind of evolutionary limitations. We evolved to deal really well with incremental change and fairly slow-moving processes. We're not wired to really be able to deal with nonlinear change. And of course, nonlinear change is at the heart of the technological changes that we've been seeing. One of our challenges is that we tend to get out ahead of ourselves in thinking and believing what technology can do and in what period of time. And we actually start treating technology and the rate of technological change as really kind of a magical force. And we start ascribing kind of almost superpower potential to the potential of technology. And it creates what I call a dreamer's gap. It is true that technological change is accelerating. It's nonlinear. But it's also true that we tend to think that it's happening faster in many cases than it actually is. But the future ultimately does arrive. It just may not arrive at the time when we think it could or should. We've been dreaming about autonomous vehicles for decades, maybe even, frankly, longer than that. And the idea of a vehicle that, unguided can take us wherever we want to go. But the dream and the reality have not synced up until very recently. And the reason is because there's been a fundamental limitation in the technological capabilities that are required to actually feasibly implement an autonomous vehicle. And one of those barriers has been addressed due to what this law represents, which is Moore's law, this curve represents, which is Moore's law. And back in the 60s, Moore was at Intel, and he made the observation that the density of transistors per unit area was doubling every 18 months. And that created a nonlinear acceleration in terms of the number of transistors that you could fit into a chip. The interesting thing about Moore's law is that it doesn't actually have to do anything with silicon technology itself. Back in the 30s, there was a paper written, I'll reference my notes to get the name, by Theodore Wright. The paper is in 1936, and as the title says, it explored the factors that affect the cost of airplanes. And his conclusion was that simply by the process of learning and becoming increasingly efficient and expert in a given industry domain, you actually could produce nonlinear improvement in cost or efficiency by simply continuous improvement. And continuous improvement is the heart at Moore's law. If you look at what's driving Moore's law, it's continuously becoming better at reducing the size of transistors on chips. So there's nothing special to chips themselves. The effect has to do with the driving forces around continuous improvement in a specific industry. So something to keep in mind. Coming back to Moore's law, 1971, the Intel 4004, which was a predecessor to the first CPUs that were in the first IBM PC, had 2,300 transistors, which it's not a trivial amount. It was certainly enough transistors to implement one of the first modern single-chip CPUs. But fast forward to 2016, an NVIDIA processor in this case the GP100, has over 15 billion transistors. I mean, the difference there is almost inconceivable, how you could go from having almost a rounding error in terms of number of transistors to 15 billion just a few years ago. When you look at, when you do the math, it's a 45-year delta between 1971 and 2016. That's 30 doublings of Moore's law, and 2 to the 30th power is about 15 billion. So the numbers actually all make sense. So, you know, we think of predictions as what's supposed to happen, what's expected to happen in the future. And then there's what actually unfolds. And the difference between those two things can be both unpredictable and significant. So let's look at that a bit further. This is a famous photo that some of you may recognize as a picture of one of my bosses. So this is a picture of Microsoft in 1978. So this was the net, membership of the entire company. So what was the technology scene, the computing scene like in 1978? It was ruled by mainframe and mini computer companies like Digital Electronic Corporation and IBM, and other brands that are no longer around. So Microsoft was not supposed to happen. That was nowhere in the playbook of how the industry would be impacted and disrupted by both Moore's law and a company that was able to really capitalize on Moore's law and how it would change the shape of computing. So let's fast forward to 1999. So this is the company snapshot. At this point, speaking of nonlinear growth, the company has achieved revenues of 19.7 billion, highly profitable, so net income of 7.8 billion. And at this point, it's still continuing to grow at a pretty good clip, 30% year to year. One thing that's important and interesting to keep in mind is that Microsoft at this point is really a business-to-business and enterprise company. The desktop and enterprise software and services division were the bulk of the business, the lion's share at 17.8. There was a consumer business, but it was much smaller at 1.2. It was kind of a hodgepodge of different things. Shares in 1999 were at an all-time high. Again, beautiful nonlinear curve of the company's stock price that reflected its business performance. It's easy to fall into a false sense of complacency, but a smart company in this position is going to be looking ahead and trying to find its next big thing. At this point in time, the PC has effectively won the battle as the world's dominant productivity tool. And just a few short years ago, that was not a foregone conclusion. Now it is. The future of the Windows PC has been firmly cemented in the landscape. And when you think about business scenarios, I mean, the PC was great at covering business and personal productivity, but that's not everything that we do as human beings all day. We spend our lives in different modes and in different scenarios. And one of the areas that where there's a big business opportunity and a potential for taking market share was in the living room. At this time, the incumbents, specifically for interactive entertainment, were Sony, Sega, and Nintendo. And it was Sony that caught RI at Microsoft more than anything else. Its share was increasing rapidly, and at this point in 1999, cumulative shipments of PlayStation were at 54 million units. Certainly nothing to sneeze at, continuing to grow at a rapid clip. So when thinking about the living room as a company like Microsoft, you have to consider your core strengths and potential weaknesses. So Microsoft, it's a software company. The DNA of the company is all about software. We also like being a high-margin business. The software business done right is a beautiful, beautiful high-margin business, and we had really a beautiful model where that high-margin software could ride on top of a low-cost third-party hardware ecosystem. And speaking of ecosystems, we knew a thing or two about building developer ecosystems. So really enriching the Windows platform by bringing third-party applications into the mix to add value. So Sony, Nintendo, and Sega, on the other hand, I mean, they really led with hardware and hardware design. They thought of themselves as hardware companies. They were good at manufacturing, they were good at supply chain management, and they were great at marketing and distributing consumer electronics, and they were consumer electronics companies. And at least that's how we thought of them when we were looking at our own strategy. So given Microsoft's core strengths and how it built its business, compared and contrasted with the existing players in the living room, what would a natural strategy for Microsoft be in that context? We sell we sell software, not hardware, and we've really built the core business by partnering with people who actually understand and deeply have deep expertise in building hardware. So what can we do that falls along those kinds of lines in the living room? Well, the strategy in 1999, the path that we were pursuing, the plans that Microsoft had were all around a partnership. In this case, partnering with Sega around something called Windows CE. So it was quite similar to the PC OEM model. Sega would sell the hardware, and they'd package in the Microsoft operating system as a piece of the platform, as an enabling piece of the platform. And as I mentioned, this Windows CE Sega partnership was well funded. There was product development, there was marketing, there was strategy. This was Microsoft's strategy at this point in time in 1999. And when you think about it in the context of what Microsoft is good at, how it built its business, the strategy sounded good on paper, but it had a couple of fatal flaws. One was that unlike the PC OEM ecosystem, Sega had its own operating system, and they had their own development system. So they effectively had a competing software stack. And furthermore, because they were not just a hardware manufacturer, they were also the content publisher. They had control over the developer ecosystem and the content itself. And these headwinds were not helped by the fact that Windows CE itself was not a great fit for the console market. You got to provide a compelling reason to developers to use product X instead of product Y. And one of the core deficiencies of Windows CE was the fact that it just wasn't very good at graphics. Graphics was not part of its essential core competency. And when you think about game consoles and interactive entertainment, these are visualization platforms. So if you're trying to enable a visualization platform, but you don't have a great graphics story, I mean, it's a massive, massive, fatal limitation. So, perhaps not surprisingly, the strategy was not working out very well. The fact is that developers were not coming on board for this Sega Windows CE partnership. Microsoft had deep pockets. There was no problem making it lucrative for a few developers to come on board and use the Windows CE platform. But there was no virtuous cycle that really could be sparked or created that created a winning situation for both the developers and for Microsoft. So talk about kind of environmental conditions that enable innovation. A lot of people think that innovation is something that can be kind of mandated or made programmatic. The fact is that my belief, the most important aspect of innovation is creating the right environment to allow it to happen. Fast forwarding a little bit to the Xbox story, there were a handful of us who, 4 of us to start with, who felt that there could be and should be a different strategy. When all was said and done and the story broke in the Wall Street Journal, the 4 of us were called renegades, which makes for an exciting media story, and media loves exciting stories and labels like that. Fact of the matter is, we didn't think of ourselves that way. Yes, we were trying to do something that was different than the official strategy at the time, but all we were doing was operating in the context that we were comfortable operating with. And keep in mind that picture from 1978. Microsoft was a disruptor, and that was something that was really baked into its DNA. And there was an element of disruption that was allowed and potentially even encouraged within Microsoft as part of that continuous strand in its DNA. So that was something that I think sometimes gets lost in the story. The fact that we could actually propose something that was radically different. So the 4 of us started talking about what could make more sense than the current Windows CE Sega partnership strategy, and we went back to the well. We said, let's go back to the thing that we do really, really well, which is the Windows PC. And we had fantastic operating system expertise. We had a world-class operating system to use as a base. We also had great graphics technology, specifically DirectX. I was leading the DirectX development team at the time, and we had built a great ecosystem on the PC. We had APIs, we had developers, we had a developer ecosystem. A lot of the game content, the cutting-edge game content that was being developed in 1999 was being developed on the PC because we had this great ecosystem and we had this great technology, which included not just software, it also included hardware and hardware industry partnerships. So we had very strong relationships with CPU vendors like Intel and AMD, and even more importantly, we had very close engagement and partnership with GPU vendors like NVIDIA and ATI. So GPUs are graphics processors. They do the heavy lifting of painting a realistic image on the screen and make graphics come alive. And that was really at the heart of DirectX and the success that we were having with the game developer ecosystem. If you wanted the latest, greatest hardware and actually be able to use it easily, Windows was the platform. So how do you take some of those assets and resynthesize them in a different way that's appropriate for the living room, appropriate in terms of user experience, appropriate in terms of the price point that's acceptable for a game console. And we felt that we could really focus all of our efforts on making it easy for developers to create the best content possible. At the end of the day, the technology under all of that is simply just an enabling delivery vehicle. We wanted to make mind-blowing content be possible in the living room. And thus was born what we originally called the DirectX box. So Xbox, its name is not a coincidence. DirectX box got shortened as a code name to Xbox. Always be careful with code names because they might become brands. So choose them carefully. But DirectX really was the heart of this platform that we were proposing. The GPU and the graphics technology would be an absolutely unique differentiator from what was available on the market and what was possible on the market. Perhaps even more importantly, I mean, you can have the most powerful thing on the planet. If no one can use it, it doesn't matter. And back to making it easy for developers, we knew how to reach developers and with APIs and tools and making it easy for them to develop great content. So that was we felt that was an incredible advantage that we have. Obviously, operating systems were in our DNA. And we also knew how to build PC architectures. The PC had been around and evolved and continued to evolve during the golden years of the Windows era. And we said, you know what, instead of building something from scratch that's proprietary and it doesn't work with our software, it doesn't work with our technologies, just use the PC architecture, at least as a starting point, to make it easy to get into the game and not have to reinvent wheels that you didn't have to reinvent. And that's the basic framing of the DirectX box concept. And when you look at the first Xbox, it really was, in a real sense, just a simplified version of a PC with a simplified version of Windows that had a living room appropriate user experience applied to it. One of the challenging decisions that we had to make was really the entry into the market and the business model around this platform. So we had gotten buy-in at this point from Bill, who made the tough call to move forward with this Xbox idea instead of the Windows C Sega direction. But we still needed to answer the question of how to actually, take this to the market. Would we still follow something that was more of a Windows PC licensing model, which you can do in various ways and still ensure a great user experience, or would we go head-to-head with the competition? Now, the thing to remember about the console business, and it's an aspect that I think is problematic in some ways, but nevertheless, when consoles are sold, the first generation, the first few years of the console is sold at a loss. So it's a hardware loss leader. You lose money on every box that you sell, on every box that you build. It's a tough business. And you need to be able to manage it in just the right way to make sure that in the later years of a console generation, manufacturing costs and component costs have come down sufficiently so that you're no longer losing money on the box. You might even make a small profit on the box. And of course, you also have to make up the differential, and that's where profit really kicks in, is with the content, through first-party content sales and third-party licensing. So it really is a razor blades model that that's tough. It's a tough business, and Microsoft had to be ready to potentially lose a lot of money. But we decided at the end of the day, if you want to take market share from Sony, if you want to take market share from the other players, you can't do that successfully with a huge, price handicap. So we had to use a very similar business model that the other players were using to be able to compete directly with them. So this is the original Xbox logo. Funny thing about it, so the code name Xbox had a dash in between the X and the box. If you go back to some of the old emails and stuff. And when we decided to move forward with this as a product, the marketing team, said, we'll come back with a name, and did a bunch of market research. By this time, the code name Xbox had leaked out, so it was broadly out there. So they came back with Xbox, but they had removed the dash. They really couldn't find anything that resonated with customers as much as this brand did for whatever reason. So that was the original console. So if you pop that open, you would find something that looked very much like a miniaturized PC using PC hardware components. One of the things that I've, over the years asked myself is, was it successful? And, part of that is answering the question of how do you measure success? I'm a little bit hardcore. I like to, for businesses to make money and to be profitable. Maybe a little bit old-fashioned of me, but looking at a roughly 10-year span of the Xbox business, and these are estimates because the numbers aren't reported directly. The estimate is that over those first 10 years of Xbox, which includes that first generation as well as the 360, which launched in 2005, that the cumulative losses were about $4.1 billion, which Microsoft scale, not the end of the world, but still, a loss is a loss. So how do you feel about that? And where I've landed is that you can't measure success or the impact of a business purely by the bottom line. It's undeniable that Xbox has been an incredibly valuable asset to Microsoft. It is in the top 500 of global brands, which is like literally all brands across the planet. And there are different ways to calculate, the value of brand, but Brand Finance, estimates the value of the Xbox brand alone at $6.8 billion, which is certainly far more than the first 10 years of cumulative losses. So, that's not too shabby. And to be clear, I mean, Bill thought, regardless of the P&L, he felt that it provided incredible lift to Microsoft as a whole. He was and I believe continues to be a huge fan of Xbox as kind of a lighthouse for the larger Microsoft brand. And this is actually a real quote, because I've heard him say this. Usually in frustration, but anyway, it doesn't diminish his affection for the Xbox platform. So let's use some of that as a lens to think about what's ahead and what's next. And just sticking purely in the domain of games. So these are some 2011 predictions about what gaming is going to look like in just a few short years. And we're back into the dreamer's gap with these predictions. like, no, we don't have holodecks, and no, we don't have, always connected gaming experiences. We get online when we want to play a game. The uncanny valley is still just as creepy, now as it was in 2011. And, the notion of single-player gaming being completely dead, that's clearly not going to happen. The reality is that, gaming in 2021 is probably going to look like this, which is pretty much how it's, how it looked in 2011. So, yeah, there's been some incredible advances in technology. VR is now on the scene. Augmented reality. There's been a few turns of. 3 turns of or more of Moore's law in that time, so the graphics are even better than ever. But there hasn't been a transformative leap, certainly in gaming in that 10 years. That said, we are into the second half of the chessboard, and I don't know how many are you are familiar with the chessboard where you start out with 1 grain of rice in the upper left-hand corner, and then just double, the rice in each square. And by the time you're in the first square of the second half of the chessboard, you're into the 4 billion grains of rice, and it just keeps growing exponentially from there. So it's we're between 17 billion and 34 billion in terms of Moore's law. And exponentially increasing our compute capability, which is, it's astonishing. One of the questions, of course, is whether Moore's law will continue to progress all the way to the end of the chessboard. Unlikely, just given pure physical limitations at the transistor sizes that we're dealing with now. At some point, you get below like the width of an atom. And it's kind of a hard stop for traditional chip manufacturing. But we've had about 35 doublings of Moore's law, which is an incredible. And when you think about it, over the span of the decades that it's held true. It is incredible. So we've seen the arc of some technologies come to fruition. The phone on the left is from the first, mobile phone from the mid 70s. So the dream was to have, mobile phones that were, light and portable. And this is a picture of the first iPhone, which I believe represents kind of the logical kind of conclusion of the arc of innovation around mobile communications. The interesting thing is that some arcs that we can imagine and can reasonably argue should have had a similar curve. We don't know where they're going to end up. So the picture on the bottom left is called a sensorama, and it was designed and built in 1962, and it was an early attempt at virtual reality. And for the time, it was actually quite amazing. But even with Moore's law, even with all the advances that we've had, and Oculus is doing some interesting things. There are some interesting new players in VR. We still don't know. We can't conceive where that arc is going to take us, if indeed anywhere. One thing that is for certain is that we are making a transition from the notion of the internet as a source of information to really having it be more of an engine of intelligence. So this is a diagram of Google's neural networks, and it's quite fascinating because really what they're modeling is a portion of our brains that is able to recognize images and infer what they are. using our own natural neural networks. But we've created synthetic neural networks, again, using a combination of software and advanced silicon technology. And coming back to the GPU, in fact. So, talked about how Xbox had a GPU and a CPU. So the CPUs, what we all use when we turn on our laptops. There's an Intel chip in there that does all the basic things that you expect your laptop and applications to do. The GPU is a little bit different. The CPU has just a few general purpose processors. It's good at basically doing everything. The GPU, on the other hand, is a radically different architecture because instead of having these large general purpose CPUs, processing engines, really advanced ones have literally thousands of individual little processors that have been optimized for processing graphics, for creating the pixels that we see on our screens. But today, we've really come full circle with GPUs because they're no longer just being used to render what we see. They're actually helping to recognize what we see. This is a fairly popular kind of test, sample set. Is it a muffin or a chihuahua? If you squint, you really can't tell. And then you think about, okay, I'm gonna ask a computer to tell me which one it is. And the amazing thing is that computers can now do this as part of the solution set, using GPUs to build neural networks that with training, just like our brains get trained, can recognize with a very high degree of accuracy whether something's a chihuahua or a muffin, or similarly, challenging discernment and really being able to understand what a computer is seeing. So we're moving from simply technology delivering something to us to more of a feedback loop where it's ingesting information from us and using that information to create insights and awareness. So it's pretty interesting how the GPU has come full circle to really help us create artificial awareness. Another use of GPUs that nobody anticipated, certainly nobody anticipated using GPUs for neural networks and artificial intelligence. No one anticipated that they'd be used to mine Bitcoin. And there's recently been a price inflation for graphics cards with GPUs that were designed for playing games, and people are instead running code on these graphics cards to mine Bitcoin because they're far more efficient at mining Bitcoin than any other piece of computing technology. So, who would have guessed? So that brings me to the final kind of thought. We can spend a lot of time worrying and fearing predictions that turn out to be wrong. And chances are that most of our predictions, certainly about AI and machine learning and machine intelligence, are going to be wrong. So Rodney Brooks is a renowned robotics researcher at MIT. And it's thought-provoking what he says, which is basically, don't give in to fear and don't let mistaken predictions, and keeping in mind that most of our predictions are going to be mistaken, govern your behavior, and instead, focus on, in my, as I would put it, inspecting and adapting the technologies that we build and how they impact us, and governing how we use them. So with that, I'd like to open it up to questions and Q&A and my general how I operate. You can ask me a question about anything. It doesn't have to be related to this presentation. So thank you.
Thank you. So, quick question. How do you anticipate quantum computing to affect perhaps Moore's Law?
It could be a replacement for Moore's Law, potentially. I think, it's in the very early experimental stage. It's literally maybe if we use an analogy at the stage of when the first transistor was invented. It's not clear yet, how it's going to affect, us. It's certainly not going to be mainstream technology anytime soon. That said, it doesn't mean that it can't be disruptive even without becoming mainstream. One of the potential applications with quantum computing is in the area of cryptography. It could disrupt all of the cryptographic technologies that we have today by taking a different approach to breaking cryptographic keys that could make what are secure keys today completely insecure with the use of quantum computing techniques. So it's definitely something to watch. Again, I don't think we should induce panic around all of our security becoming obsolete because of quantum computing. And what I find is that over the arc of technology, usually when there's there's something innovative that happens that could be a threat. There's usually some kind of counterbalance that appears in the market. So I think that's likely to happen with quantum computing as well.
What do you think will be the most disruptive technologies in future 10 years?
It's, again, I'm going to be wrong. But I do think that, machine learning, machine intelligence, I think is going to be disruptive. I think we're just at the beginning stages of really being able to have intelligent systems. Autonomous vehicles are part of that. When you look at the future of transportation, I think there's going to be a point, in the future where we look back and can't even understand why anyone was allowed to drive a vehicle because computing systems, intelligent systems are going to be far safer in general than human beings. So I think that's really it's hard to squeeze down into a single kind of product level disruption because this one's not about any particular product. It's about being able to use data in a way that we haven't been able to use data before, to quite literally create decision engines that are competing with our own ability.
So recently, The Economist wrote about brain-computer interfaces, and they were very skeptical about that hitting the mainstream. I'm just curious to know what are your views on this technology? Do you see it being a mainstream technology?
So I've had, the privilege, given my background in computer graphics, to, have experienced some of the more advanced prototypes for VR, and VR could certainly be disruptive. Those systems executed well really do create an illusion that you're literally in another space, in another a synthetic environment. But again, just like the Sensorama didn't take off, there are practical issues around commercializing VR at scale. So, I'm a little bit. On one hand, there's incredible potential there. On the other hand, it's hard to see how that commercialization gap is going to be closed. Augmented reality, I think, is more feasible to implement at scale. But again, there needs to be a compelling use case for AR. Pokemon Go is great, and it's an interesting example of augmented reality, and it fits more naturally into kind of our current device ecosystem and kind of our user interface metaphors, if you will. But it's hard to know what disruptive technology will come along that overcomes some of those obstacles. So there are technologies that, for example, can project an image straight onto into your eye. For example, that could remove the obstacle of having to wear a bulky headset. I think there are going to be incremental innovations with these things. The fact that the iPhone 10 has a camera with a depth sensor, that's pretty amazing actually when you think about the technology. Can now be that was with first commercial application was Connect on Xbox, and now it's on every one of these. So I think there'll be incremental innovation. That's pure goodness, but it's not clear what the next breakthrough in human-computer interaction is going to be.
Thank you. Yes, it's hot microphone. Yes, I was wondering, what do your colleagues, your company, you, or who's keeping an eye on the dark side of development, which is the hackers, and being they 16-year-old kids in their mom and dad's basement in Peoria hacking into the Pentagon or nation states. What do you and your colleagues in your company think about them as far as, they're paralleling, they're having fun at it too, and they're enthusiastic and they're paralleling developments. And does anybody keep an eye on them or postulated what's going on in the future with them, with their ability to erase advances and developments?
Yep. The security landscape, and my company has a fairly significant security portfolio. One of the challenges with security is that the landscape changes continuously. The threat vectors are constantly evolving, and it's like pushing a bubble under a sticker. The problem just kind of shifts, and the challenge shifts around. I had the privilege of being at the World Economic Forum this year in Davos, and there was one of the exciting events there was the launch of a global cybersecurity center. And part of what drove the creation of that center is the realization and the acknowledgement and the embrace of needing greater cooperation between governments themselves and between industries and governments to share information, to share best practices, to share new defensive technologies, to mitigate risk when risk appears in a much more coordinated fashion than what is being done today. And so at a global scale, there does need to be more of an integrated approach to security. One of the things that I worry about with security is actually back to AI and machine learning. Those techniques can be used for fantastic innovations like safe autonomous vehicles. They can also be used for for malevolent intent. That's something that we have to keep an eye on, and I'm very interested in, on the other hand, using machine learning and machine intelligence to, as a defensive measure, to thwart hacking and and intrusions. Like for example, the Sony hack, the famous Sony hack that happened not too long ago. In a better world, the system that was compromised and hacked would have been self-aware. The systems, around, that made up that architecture, ideally would have been self-aware to even understand that they were hacked. The fact that so many hacks are only detected a long time after they happen, is part of the challenge here. So that kind of system self-awareness, is something that ideally could be addressed, can be addressed with AI and machine learning and machine intelligence techniques.
So I'm curious about, there have been recent conversations about like ethics of software engineers and computer scientists and how they're contributing towards like maybe biasing algorithms, decisions that computers are now making for us nowadays. So I'm curious, what sort of ethical mistakes or issues are we needing to address like at this moment in terms of ideas behind how computers are making decisions that maybe humans should be, such as like filtering out candidates for a job application or even medical decisions, or even in terms of like autonomous driving, other issues you might be thinking of.
So, there's a big question of, around just trust. Can we trust some algorithm to, produce the right result? Part of the challenge with AI and machine learning and any kind of complex algorithm that is making a decision is, can you explain how it made that decision? So there's a lot of research in AI in particular around explainable AI. Like, well, an answer popped out, but how did you get that answer? There's so much of what goes into any kind of neural network or decision-making algorithm is the data sets that you feed it. It's the old, garbage in, garbage out problem. How do you make sure that the training data that you provide some kind of learning system is the data that's going to produce the right results? And what does right mean? So I think there are, we're getting into an area where we have moral and ethical issues that we have to start contending with as we increasingly expect and develop effectively machines that we expect to operate in our own capacity. So it's there's not an easy answer to that question, but I think we certainly need to proceed cautiously, and back to the delta between computer can't possibly be right and the computer is always right. What's the balance that we need to strike between those extremes, I think is going to be a very important question for us.
Historically speaking, enterprise companies have typically been very protective of their proprietary software, but that has of late been changing. Where do you think the relationship between proprietary and open source is going, and what's your analysis of that?
I love open source. My company uses a lot of open source. We're part of a number of open source projects. But they do have limitations. One of the areas where you don't see a whole lot of open source is with security, because it's a net disadvantage, obviously, to reveal the security technologies that that you're using, certainly at the source code level. So I think market forces, natural market forces, tend to find the pockets of areas in the ecosystem where open source makes sense, and those areas where open source is not the right tool to get the job done. There's also a hybrid between open source and proprietary. And it has to do really with the business model. So a lot of people kind of look at open source and think, well, that's free. The fact is, everything has a cost, whether that cost is direct or indirect. Red Hat has a great business model around open source with their Linux distributions, because as it turns out, it's really kind of a pain to keep up with all the patches and changes that people are contributing into the Linux open source project. And the industry needed, basically a trusted entity who would, number one, take care of all of that, all of that work, and effectively put a seal of approval on the versions of Linux that it provides its customers. So, the business model, the company is based on open source, but it's monetizing open source by creating enough value on top of just the source code that's valuable enough for companies to use. I don't know if that answered your question, but.
Yeah, so looking back at your time at the Xbox, I mean, it's been a while for me, but in high school, it seemed like everybody was buying the Xbox to play the Halo games.
Yep.
How important was that in the growth of Xbox?
That's a great question, and the Halo franchise, I think, was critical to the success of the platform. Not so much because it's a great game, it is, but because it really baked in the idea of a connected experience. Moving from sticking in the DVD and playing a game through and as a solitary experience to one that's connected. And Xbox Live has been an incredibly important and valuable piece of the franchise, and that was part of the early vision, which needed the industry to kind of catch up a little bit to be able to make it feasible. You needed enough people with a decent internet connection to actually make that kind of connected game experience possible. But you know, I really, in my mind, I think of Halo and Xbox Live as really you know, an integral piece in a real sense. And by the way, you know, the Xbox Live model, you know, is a fantastic, you know, it's a subscription business model, recurring revenue. You know, when you get an engine like that going, you know, it's a beautiful thing. So, great question.
We have time for one last question.
What is your greatest fear and your greatest dream about technologies?
You know, this may sound a little crazy, but you know, everything that we've done, certainly with digital technology, you know, is like, you know, layers of a building, you know, and it's in a real sense, it's kind of a fragile ecosystem. You know, when you think about how many companies on the planet, you know, can actually build, you know, an advanced computer chip and all of the technologies that relies on. You know, you just remove one critical element, and you know, you could you know, have a massive disruption, you know, in the supply chain. You know, so it's I worry about frankly the fragility of the technology ecosystem. In a related sense, I worry about the robustness of the internet globally. You know, it was very clear again at the World Economic Forum that the global economy depends on, you know, the internet functioning and functioning well. I mean, can you imagine a global, you know, internet outage, you know, that lasts, you know, a day or a week, right? So that's what you know, I worry about, kind of the infrastructure aspect to technology, you know, more than anything else. I do worry about unintended consequences. I certainly worry about, you know, not being able to see what's ahead and finding you know, finding technology being, you know, being applied, you know, for evil rather than good. But that's, you know, I would hate to have to start over. It's you know, a lot of pieces in the technology arena have had to come together just the right way with just the right people to get to where we are. But it is fragile. You know, my hope, and it's in the same spirit as using, you know, technology, you know, for good. I think looking at machine intelligence, AI, learning systems, you know, autonomous vehicles. You know, I think technology is on the cusp of being able to, you know, help live richer, more creative lives and focus more on, you know, our potential as human beings rather than some of the more mundane things that we spend our time doing. So that's the dream. Thank you.